Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in with me, Patrick, at Holy Seven. Today, I have my guest with me, Derek Cummins. He appeared on Pints of Aquinas talking about being a catechumen either in Orthodoxy or Catholicism, and is in Orthodoxy and has his own podcast called The Dose of Theosis, where he talks about Eastern rites, particularly within the Coptic and Ethiopian traditions, as he's getting involved with that. But I have him on to talk about the differences between a little bit the East and the West, and seeing if there's any common ground and maybe what the West is missing, what the East is missing. So thank you for coming on, Derek.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. Thank you for inviting me and reaching out. I appreciate friendship.
Nice. So if you can, I guess, give a little bit before we kind of like really dive into the conversation and things like that, in addition to my intro, if you can give a little bit of your background and what gave you, I guess, that tilt into, or what was the thing that was just like, okay, I'm going Orthodox.
Yeah. I mean, the long story is I kind of, after being nominally Christian most of my life, had kind of a conversion experience while touring with a heavy metal band, became a serious Christian. Not long after that, found myself in seminary. Not long after that, found myself as a youth pastor in a Pentecostal church. And from that moment, I already had this like liturgical bent, and was very interested in spiritual formation, was introduced to like classically Jesuit spirituality, Ignatian spirituality, praying the hours, did all of this as a Protestant. And then as I just started doing a deep dive in church history, I was confronted with Eastern Orthodoxy, fell in love with that spirituality, that prayer life, that just that theology of theosis, of becoming by grace what God is by nature, that something could actually take place and change in me. So fell in love with Orthodoxy, and then by mistake one day discovered that Eastern Catholicism existed, and that started a very long process of discerning, figuring out like which is the path for me. And I think maybe some knee-jerk reactions to some things that I've seen in the West, just practically speaking, but also just not having the framework to really grasp Western theology enough to say like, yeah, I agree with that. That's probably what kept me from going over the line into Catholicism full tilt.
Gotcha. And so that's something I kind of want to touch on. So I mean, I was born and in the Roman kind of like the Western Roman Rite tradition, being Polish Catholic, but recently, basically because why this podcast in general exists is because of I was really touched by Jonathan Pageau's work and symbolism and stuff like that, and I realized that there was something in the Eastern rites and Orthodoxy and Eastern Catholicism that seems to be lacking in the West, right? So I to give some people a picture, I'm a traditional guy. Like, I went to the Latin Mass. I love the Latin Mass, but I can't deny that there's something in there still that I have like a fear that it's to some extent the where it's headed is crumbling again, right? And so I want to see what is it, do you think, that the East maybe possesses still that kind of lets it, like, where that mystery and it's really open to like the mystics and stuff, I feel, more so than the Western right is in the modern day, at least.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you hit the nail on the head with like the mystery, right? Like, that's the word. That's the distinctive of the Eastern expression of Christianity. The West has a long history of defining things, and sometimes I think to its detriment. I mean, the West is much more comfortable going into speculative theology and trying to name everything that God is and figuring things out. There's a very active component on that, whereas the East has always been a very receptive methodology for doing theology, I guess you could say. It's like we don't trifle with what's been handed to us. So like tradition is everything in the East. So we don't mess with the liturgy, right? We don't mess with the scriptures. We don't mess with the theological dogmas that have been handed to us. Like, we don't necessarily try to like add to that. I think that's probably the biggest difference, because then what you tend to see in some of these, like, and I'm going to go, I will turn this around, like we were chatting offline before we started. I'll turn this back around on my own tradition. Don't worry. But I think in those like radical traditionalist movements, like the Latin Mass movements in the West, which I've been to like one Latin Mass ever. I'm not super familiar with that community other than from what I've seen online, which I know is not positive. Have a death grip on the tradition. They have a death grip on defining things as this is the way, and there's not a lot of room for gray. And, you know, I think as you talked about, like, is it going to crumble? Or are they going to lose their tradition because of that? I think when you try to over-define your tradition, you lose your tradition. And like I described to you before, a house that's well built has to have some flexibility in it. Like, it has to be able to move and breathe. And if it doesn't, it's going to crack when the winds get really strong. So, and crumble and break, and that's a problem. But we see that in the East too, with, you know, the orthobro movements and the people that are basically all of these converts to Orthodoxy that either have come from the traditional Catholic movement, which is not uncommon. They just try to get so traditional, they get fed up and they leave and they become Orthodox, but they keep the same, you know, the word phronema, the same mindset, the same lens through which they're filtering all of their theology. They keep that. So then they try to apply that strict application to Eastern theology, which isn't made to have that application put on it. And then it starts to break apart too. So really I don't know. I'm really good at criticizing things and then criticizing something else and then saying, but we need both of those things. So it's like, the problem is everybody overreacts to everything. I think we need the Western gumption to define things and to go into some like uncharted territory and try to figure some things out. But that shouldn't exist without the counterbalance of the Eastern way of like, no, we're not going to trifle with this. We're just going to take what the fathers have, what the apostles taught, what the fathers kept, and what's been handed on to us. So, because you can either become a museum or you can become an innovation lab, and neither of those things are good.
Yeah. Now, there's two things you mentioned that I think are important to touch on, but the first one I want to kind of touch it is you mentioned that the West has a tendency to define things, right? And so another person I really enjoy, and I think you had him on your podcast, is Nicholas Kotar. And Nicholas Kotar was also on Pines. And one interesting thing he was saying on there is that when telling a story, particularly about saints, right? And I completely agree with him on this point, is that there's no reason to have everything exactly defined within that person's lifestyle, and it's completely okay to have legendarium, or you can say mythos, is surrounding a saint in order that better explains his telos than just saying in 1866 so and so did this, right? Where you see that like with Saint Patrick, I see it the most, where there's that ancient story of him where there's myths of him turning pagans to werewolves. He himself turns into a deer, like the pagans can put out his fires. And then there's the, like, you can say a more Western interpretation of the story where they get rid of all of that. And it's just, no, St. Patrick is actually this. He was abducted by these pirates in this year. This, you know, like, it's way more defined and almost forensic. But I don't think people work, like, it's hard to participate in a story like that. It's much easier to participate in a story where you have, it's more grander, right, to a certain extent. And once again, I see that preservation a little bit more in the East, especially with iconography and different stuff like that. I don't know if you have anything to add on, or maybe explanation why that is, maybe what's in the Orthodox tradition or the Eastern traditions that allows that to exist.
Yeah, Deacon Nicholas is phenomenal, and he's a good friend of mine, and I actually worked for him for a while, so I got to kind of swim in those waters and hear him talk about things a lot and make sense of that. That was jarring coming from a Western Protestant background, right? Like, no matter what way you cut it, like, Protestantism is Western, so it's operating with a lot of the same methodology that Western Roman Catholicism is. So, like, you know, early on, I start running into stories of like you're talking about the saints, like Saint Nicholas, right? Saint Nicholas is in the hagiography for Saint Nicholas. It's like on Wednesdays and Fridays and fasting periods, he wouldn't nurse from his mother because he was fasting when he was an infant, or he stood in his baptismal font for hours on end praising God. Well, infants don't stand, and infants have to eat, and they don't have like the mental faculty to choose to refuse it and things like that. But, you know, Deacon Nicholas was quick to point out, like, yeah, it's true, but I'm not saying it's factual. And that's like the classical way of storytelling, where it's like you learn things and you enter into them, like you're saying. So that's actually been like hugely refreshing, first of all, as I read the scriptures too, because prior I always felt like I had to give some scientific, rational explanation to atheists or to anybody who wanted to combat me on like the scriptures themselves, of like, well, how does this happen? How's that going to happen? And you can only push the whole, like, the reality that like God is God and miracles are real. Like these things are going to happen. But then like, what do you do with some of the things that are like apparently evil in the scriptures, or like, you know, things where like, I don't know why the line that's coming to my mind in the Psalms is like, you know, God will dash their infants on the rocks and stuff like that. And people are like, well, how do you make sense of that? When you start passing it through more of like that symbolic storytelling lens, like that's conveying a reality and a truth about evil itself and not necessarily individuals. I hope that's clear. It might not be, but bring me back on track here. Where did you want me to land with this? I already forgot.
No, it's okay. No, so I was asking in terms of, even in storytelling, of the Orthodox seem to keep in general the myth, like you can say, I'm not saying myth as in it's fake. I'm talking,
Right.
I guess, I mean the mythology as like just a grander, more symbolic language when explaining the life of a saint, for example, where the West pretty much, for the most part, abandoned a lot of it, right? So I guess, you know, my question was maybe what is in the Orthodox tradition and stuff that kind of calls to keep that?
Yeah. I definitely think it's that idea of storytelling. It's that idea of something can be real and true without being factual. And I think that's what's prevented, you know, the Eastern Christians of any stripe from going down the road of like that over definition, you know, that like, okay, well, how is this real? And we need to come up with a theology to explain it. And now we need to have like notes to back up the story. Whereas we're totally comfortable with saying like, this may or may not have actually happened the way that it's written, but it's still true. And we can still accept it. It still teaches us something about who God is and who we are and how we relate to God. Like there's nothing that's going to take away from that. Whether the story was, again, factual, I guess, so to say.
Yeah, I think it's also more of participation. I think there's a recognition that we participate with the world in a particular way that doesn't necessarily always have to be like scientifically accurate, you can say. So
Right.
Factually, the Earth is round, but in the symbolic world, for example, we say that the Earth is more flat than it is round, and water is more wet than it is H2O, because that's how we participate with those things, right? You don't every day when you're out about in the world, you don't even think about it, but to you, the world is flat, right? Like even though it's actually round, you don't need to know that it's round until you need to use that, you can say, data for something else. In the same sense, even how we experience each other, like I don't need to know that you're made up of organs and different stuff like that. Like I interact with the image of you, right? And so even that to me is more true than having like someone telling me I'm made up of molecules or whatever, you know, like going down to into the parts, so to speak, as it is said. But the second thing I wanted to touch on that you mentioned earlier was the grasping of tradition, right, and not letting it move. Now, René Guénon, actually, he was a French perennial philosopher, but he talks about the Holy Grail and basically says that the Holy Grail is symbolic of tradition, right? And so it's something you lose, and you look back to gain it. It's something you lost that gave, you can say, an aspect of your life or meaning, and then you lose it, so you look for it again, right? And so in a sense, I mean, Eastern cultures have a story. I think Persians have something similar to the Holy Grail, but it's called something else. But it seems in particular a kind of like a curse of the West, like losing tradition and trying to go for it again. Evident in the Latin Mass, right? Like we had the Latin Mass, and then we lost it, and now we're gaining it again and grasping it, right? You can say like we're holding on to the Holy Grail and just like latching onto it, but we're forgetting why the Holy Grail itself is meaningful, right?
Yeah.
And so, do you see anything like that within the Eastern Rite too, of like this forgetting, you can say, the fullness of the image of our faith, and just kind of narrowing down or getting tunnel vision in tradition?
Yeah, it's interesting. The two things that come to mind, well, one's actually not even like in the Eastern Rite or the Byzantine expression. One is like, are you familiar with like the Western Rite Orthodox?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's maybe an example of it, where it's like, hey, we want to take this liturgical expression from, I think, like the 6th century that hasn't grown along with the Byzantine expression post-schism, and we want to try to reclaim it and bring it back and like reinvigorate it. Well, there's things that have happened since then, so now there's like this retroactive application of things like, I mean, I guess like you've heard the terms Latinizations in the Eastern Catholic churches, like Byzantizations. Like let's put an epiclesis where it didn't go before, and let's get rid of the statues and bring in icons, and like let's make sure that we use like, I don't know, different elements that maybe weren't organic to it in the first place. And the whole thing is for the sake of like, well, this is just our Western tradition and we have to have it. But nobody even knows why they have to have it. It's just like, is it just for the sake of, I'm from the West and I want it? I don't know. That's one thought. And the other, I would say, in like Eastern Catholic circles, one thing that I've noticed with like the Eastern Catholic churches that do it well, that are like completely Orthodox, like capital O in their expression, tend to have to do that at the expression of probably the more important parts of our faith, which are like, love and charity and kindness and Matthew 25 stuff, like feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, welcoming in the stranger, visiting the sick and the imprisoned, and, all these things, where it becomes like we have to become so uptight about maintaining the fullness of this tradition at the expense of like a lot of the things that Jesus preached when he was on earth and a lot of the things that he lived. I hope that answers.
No, that was good. And so do you think that there's a possibility for, so I think that like you can say the conflict, I think, between, for example, the Roman Catholics and, for example, Eastern Orthodox is the same conflict that's happening between like men and women. I feel like it's this like, I heard it said that like the Eastern Rite is very motherly or more feminine like, and the Western Rite's more like very masculine. And because of our brokenness, to some extent, we've like, men don't understand completely women, and women don't completely understand men, and that's part of the conflict, you can say, in life through our brokenness. Do you think that's kind of that I'm kind of right in describing that brokenness between, you can say, the Eastern Orthodox and maybe like the Roman Catholics as well? Like, I know there's like theology, like specific theologies and stuff, probably they're in disagreements, but like in a general sense, and like what in language I guess we've been speaking, do you think that's a good description of kind of like the disconnect that maybe that's happening?
I think it's really fair, actually, because you think about like typical understanding is women are far more intuitive and kind of like a deeper connection with their emotional life and these sort of things, and men typically are known for being much more like logic and reason driven, and not emotional, right? So it's funny, like, again, as we're talking about this, like the Western expression tends to be driven by like philosophy, Like the couch of theology in the West is philosophy. Like, and then in the East, it's much more about this like tradition, reception. It's definitely not emotional, but there is much more of a flowery expression to it. If you've ever read the hymns of the East, you know, like some very over the top language that's very emotional in a lot of ways and very driven by that sort of thing. So I think that's fair. I definitely think that's fair, which makes it all the more interesting that there's all of this like cross pollination going on, where there's like everywhere online, it's like Protestant becomes Catholic, Catholic becomes Orthodox, Orthodox becomes Catholic, Orthodox becomes Protestant. And like, there's just all of this moving around, and everybody's like, okay, why did you do it? Because it's the truth. Okay, well, you're both saying the same thing, and like, who's right there? And now you're kind of like getting this weird diluting that's happening, where you have people who are brought up and raised in one framework only, trying to enter into another one in a very short amount of time, and then trying to like proclaim themselves an expert on it. Where it's like, you know, I've been on paper, in reality, Orthodox for like a year and a half. Like, it would be very foolish of me to say that I fully understand that framework. You know, I'll speak to it as much as I can, but like, the person who grew up in like Eastern Europe in a tiny village and went to a parish church at the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains is going to know all of this in a way that I'm probably never going to know it. And they haven't had to read any books to do it. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so do you think even within the there's certain traditions within the Eastern Rite? Like, I know you've been doing a little bit of exploring this on A Dose of Theosis. So if anyone's interesting to like see this more in depth, you can tune into Derek's podcast. But
Please do.
You talked to someone, a biker, I believe, that went towards the Coptic tradition, and then you also talked to Ethiopian, I think he's a deacon, right?
Yeah.
And so those have even, from my general understanding, even like a more almost like deeper mystical connection, like almost like a more deeper rooted tradition. You know, there's even certain Ethiopian, or I believe they're Orthodox, that claim that they're from the direct lineage of Abraham, right? That they possess that. So what have you learned so far? Some like basic things from those traditions, and how is that maybe helping you in your faith journey?
Yeah, I mean, the whole like symbolic world thing with Jonathan Pageau definitely finds its most extreme outer limit in the Ethiopian tradition, I think, where they're just like totally cool with myth and story and participation in it via that. And it's a very strong tradition, but it's like relatively untouched by outsiders. So there's not a lot of the issues that we're seeing between like Byzantine Eastern Orthodox and Catholicism in that regard. The Coptic tradition, I mean, the Copts are so beautiful, man. It's just like the most gorgeous thing, where there's this like very, the word I use primitive, but I don't mean that in like a pejorative sense. It's just a very primitive of the people, a very like folk liturgy that is just insanely beautiful and insanely holy and mystical, but without this death grip on the tradition, because this is a people that's been more worried about martyrdom and being beheaded than trying to like deal with any of that other stuff. So yeah, it's interesting because there's also in the Coptic tradition like not a lot of this same, there's not a lot of conversations about this going on in the Coptic tradition. Like, nobody's sitting around talking about like myth and story and these sort of things. But at the same time, like, I was just visiting with some friends last week who are Coptic Orthodox, and they were sharing stories of this trip they took to Egypt to serve a Coptic Orphans Foundation. And like, you know, they were just talking about stories of this one saint that they have, and they're like, oh, he was actually the first martyr for Jesus Christ. Like when Joseph was awoken in a dream, awoken, I think is the right word, right grammatical word, was, you know, he waked up.
No, I think
anyway, he had a dream. Yeah, he had a dream, right? And he takes Jesus and Mary to Egypt, And they say that this saint was there when Jesus was a young boy, and like they had some story about the infant Jesus like talked to this man and told him who he was and what he was going to do, and like that he had to do something, and ended up being martyred because of that. So like when Jesus was 3 years old or something, this man was martyred. He was the first martyr, even before like the deacon Stephen, you know, which most people say Stephen was the first martyr. But in the Coptic tradition, there's this like myth of this saint that was martyred when Jesus was a child, even because he was one of the first believers. And it's like, okay, I don't know what to do with that, but they asked the priest Abuna, Daniel, and he was just like, yeah, I don't know. I've never heard that before. But this guy who went to Egypt to serve said, like, everybody's talking about this over there. So there's a lot more of a folk element in the Oriental Orthodox traditions and in the Coptic tradition and the Ethiopian tradition, at least in those two. I haven't spent a lot of time with like the Armenians or the Syro-Malabar, or is it Malankara, or anything like that.
Do you think it's possible? So, from your experience, I know you have a limited experience, for example, in the Latin Mass and stuff like that, but I guess, do you think it is possible to, I guess, is it possible to bring back, you can say, the enchantment or that mythical things to the West, and then to just balance it out? Do you think, because it sounds like I'm ragging on Roman Catholics a bunch, which I'm not. The reason I'm having discussion is I want to learn if it's possible to kind of save that tradition through these mysteries or whatever, to like kind of reclaim that. But do you think, to kind of balance it out, do you think that the Eastern Rite sometimes, or the Orthodox, have lean a little bit too much on the mystery sometimes, where it could call for defining a little bit sometimes once in a while, or like naming things? So let's start first with as far as, how do you think it's possible to, you can say, re-enchant the West, and if that's even possible?
Yeah, I think it's kind of not possible. Like, I'm of the opinion, I recently did kind of a very brief study on like wild saints, right? Like the desert saints or the Celtic saints, the cave saints. And basically when the world went insane around them, they weren't out necessarily trying to preach and change minds. They were like, okay, now's the time to retreat, become holy through like prayer, asceticism, and small community, and just circle the wagons and basically let what's going on fizzle out and die. And then we go back and we build. You know, there's no sense, I think, trying to rebuild something that's on fire. Like you're not going to do it. And at this point, the fire's too big to put out, I think. But I do think that it's going to be the East that reinvigorates the West, because there was a point in time where the East was struggling and the West was there. So the Eastern Catholics need to be very strong right now, and the Eastern Orthodox need to be very strong right now in order for that to happen.
I mean, I think I agree with you. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, to use like metaphorical language, maybe it's not even metaphorical, but obviously the sun rises in the east and then sets in the west. And it seems we're in a period where, like, you can say the sun is setting in the west, and maybe we're waiting for it to reappear in the east again. Kind of thing.
I think you're right. And we kind of, I think, see some glimpses of that. I mean, there seems to be, maybe it's just the circles in which I spend my time, but there seems to be a mass exodus of Western Catholics going to the Eastern Rite Catholic churches, and a lot of converts to the Eastern Orthodox Church. So a lot of people are looking to the East right now because they're dry, they're parched, they're dying. They're, you know, they need that nourishment of a mystical experience of God, a worshipful experience of God. But I hope that it doesn't become an idol. Like, I don't want the liturgy to become an idol. You know, I don't want mysticism to become an idol or anything like that. And that's the interesting thing about the Oriental traditions. Like, as I study those, are like, they're just not willing to go down certain roads. They're like, why would I want to go down that road in my mind when I could just bow down before God and worship him? And I'm like, yeah, I love that. But that has its limitations too. Like, what happens when you need an answer about something difficult? Like, I think like one of the beautiful things about Catholicism is like Catholic social teaching, and like bioethics and things like that. You know, in the Eastern Orthodox and in the Oriental Orthodox world, if you ask a question about certain things, like you're going to get a different answer from every priest. And like maybe that's also true in Catholicism. Every priest might tell you something different, but at least you have some, like, I can grab the book and flip to a certain page and find like what's the official answer on something. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. And so, and then I guess, I mean, you kind of, I guess, touched on it just now already, dude. So, you think that in the Eastern Rite, they could use a little bit of defining here and there, not rely so completely on mystery, let's say.
Right. And generally, like, we refer to mystery when it comes to the things of God, but like, I just think even in some practical things, you know, like there was an example. It's a terrible example, but I visited a small Antiochian parish one time that had a full like literature rack, right? And on there was like, what do Orthodox believe about? And I grabbed that little pamphlet and I was flipping through it, and it had like an article on abortion. What does the Orthodox Church believe about abortion? And it talks about that it's a grave sin, it's an ill, it's murder, it's not okay. It said, but pregnancy should be prevented either by natural family planning or contraception. Like, it said that in this article. This pamphlet wasn't endorsed by the bishops, but it was printed by a pretty large Orthodox media outlet. And like, I showed that to a priest at another parish, and he was like, that shouldn't be out. Like, we can't do that. Like, that's not the Orthodox stance on it. But like, what is the Orthodox stance on it? You know, like, it's a problem that we have, that we can't define something like that, where that's like a big question for married couples, is like, how do we handle our fertility and like sexual ethics and things like that? Feasibly, I could go to priest after priest until I get the answer that I want, rather than having to conform my will to something revealed or defined, or you know, something that has authority. It's an issue.
I see. That's interesting. What's it called? I guess sometimes I'm a little what's the word? Like tilted, I guess, so much because of so much of maybe I'm enamored so much by the mystery because I'm so used to the definitive, and part of me has been seeing kind of like, you know, like, this isn't always necessarily like one thing that I enjoyed to bring it to so it makes sense is what Jonathan Pajot talked about in one of his videos, the symbolism of the pentagram. And for example, like the pentagram in itself is not like a satanic symbol necessarily. They use it because it represents what the satanic does, but the symbol in itself is not evil, right? Like, as a matter of fact, it is even a Christian symbol. Same with the upside down cross, you know, for the West, you know, the upside down crucifixion of Peter and stuff. So, so for me, sometimes the rules, I guess, or the like definition can be too much sometimes, where we forget our own tradition within the laws in some sense, right? So, we know evil is bad.
Like,
yeah.
Like, another example that I think of is like, you know, something of a stumbling block for Eastern Christians is like the Immaculate Conception, right? The definition of that. And we're like, why did we have to go that next step to define it? Like, why did we have to say these certain things? Like, we've always agreed she's Panagia, she's all holy. Like, we've always agreed that she'd had no personal sin. Like, why do we have to say this extra thing, which is really more of a commentary on the issue of original sin than it is about anything else? But then, like, I feel that way, but then I hear, like, you know, you can study certain Orthodox thinkers and saints and theologians. Some of them have totally affirmed the Immaculate Conception. Some of them have not. Some of them have been like the total other end of the spectrum on it. And it's like, which is worse, to over-define something or to not be able to have an answer?
That's such a paradoxical question for me, in a sense.
Yeah.
I don't know if we can even answer that one, to be honest, because it's
me either. I don't know what's worse, you know.
Yeah,
you just have to live in one. But
yeah, and I mean, I think that's the other important thing. I think we live in such a crazy time sometimes that we're so dualistic and things like that sometimes we forget to just like live it, right? So I mean, the reason stories and different stuff exist is from people's experiences, right, in the world. And so but you never had to necessarily think about, let's say, a fairy or a siren or something. You just lived it. Like you knew they
Yeah.
existed because you had that experience with whether you like, it's not important that the woman, like, I feel like some people get caught up, especially atheists and stuff, like there's obviously no woman with like a biological fishtail, but that's not the
Yeah.
point, right? It's about a woman, like this chaotic woman, this beautiful woman that steals your attention, where you fall into a meaningless relationship, right? Like there's many men that had that experience, but you don't
Yeah.
necessarily have to talk about it because everyone just like lived it. And then later those stories served either a warning or whatever for people, and it was just in this experience.
Yeah.
But yeah,
It's interesting, like, how many people have read stories and fairy tales and Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia and said, like, this was so formative for me. Like this built my soul. This built my capacity for spirituality. But I don't know anybody who's ever read a textbook and said that same thing. And it's like, okay, which one is more correct about the way the world works? Well, honestly, I would argue Lord of the Rings is more correct about the way the world works.
I'm with you on that. Yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that we don't need both sorts of things.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so we're going into a little bit. So yeah, I think I think we need both. But for example, I think so Ian McGilchrist has a book called The Master and His Emissary, talking about the difference between the left and right hemisphere of the brain. And he uses the story of the Master of the Emissary, which is basically like the master is the right hemisphere of the brain, and the master is basically a person that sees the whole image of like how the world in general works, but he misses details every once in a while. And so his emissary, the left hemisphere of the brain, is there to kind of like fill in those details when he needs them, right? The problem becomes is when the emissary decides to kill his master and then becomes the master himself, because then he becomes a tyrant, because then he doesn't see the bigger picture. He's just too focused on the details. And so what it's that so to kind of bring this together, it's that what you were saying, that like you only need to know about someone's organs when you need to operate on someone, like when that comes in there. But our day-to-day lives, we don't necessarily need to know that. Like I don't have to look at you and think, that degrading element of most nihilistic culture says now is like, you're just a meat bag with eyes, right? Like I see the being within you. That's the realm that we all live in. But when it comes time to operate whatever, then of course you have to go down into the parts of something and view it in that manner, right? And so
and generally you only need to operate when there's a disease there, right?
Yeah.
And I think historically that's the way the church has operated, is like an ecumenical council only happened in reaction to a disease, to a heresy. And somewhere, I think in the West, I haven't studied the Western understanding of the ecumenical councils past between ecumenical council 7 and Vatican II, but it seemed that there was a movement from we only dissect and we only cut and we only define when we have to in reaction to a heresy, to now we're just defining things. I guess another example there was like, not that this was an ecumenical council, but like the Declaration of the Immaculate Conception. Like, to define something like that is to move in the authority of an ecumenical council, like in a very similar way. And maybe I'm not using the right language, and that's fine. But that sort of definition only happened in reaction to a heresy, and there was no heresy going on that warranted doing that, I don't think. Nevertheless, I could probably still defend it, actually. So yeah, actually, I think that example that you're using about like the hemispheres of the brain, the emissary, and these things, like I think is a pretty good analogy for the East and the West, where the East has like this big picture mindset, and you don't want the West to behave like a tyrant over that.
Yeah,
because it's too caught up in the details.
Yeah, people hate me for it, but I always point to Renaissance art as, you can say, the fruit of that mentality. because obviously, like the creation of Adam and the Sistine Chapel and everything like that is such a beloved paintings and stuff, because it's so rooted in our, you can say, I guess, in within our aesthetic and stuff now. But after just like learning the meaning and symbology of the stories and stuff like that, I hate it. And it's for, it's kind of for two reasons. One is um, there's almost an embellishment of passions by making it so realistic. So then you forget about necessarily the image as a whole, like as a story, and you're really focused in on you start looking at like the gradient of the lighting, or like the musculature and the person, instead of seeing like Adam as a whole, right?
I'm trying to look to see if I have a good icon example of like storytelling in an icon. And like this is like the classical example, right? Like the Sinai Christ.
Yeah, exactly.
Where it's like, one side is indicative of his humanity and the other side of his divinity, like the compassionate Lord, and like,
and then the judge
of everything. And
and then if you have the fuller image, the judgment side is also holding the book, right? And then his humanity is holding he's doing the sign of the blessing, right?
Right.
But yeah, exactly. And so, but yeah, there became this like over embellishment of the details in the West. And then later it went even crazier, where they started people painting like the back of heads of people and stuff like that, which there's no need for that in a painting other than to show how far in the detail you can get, right? Like how realistic you can make it look. But I think that's a perfect example of the mindset of the thing. But yeah, I've had so many conversations with people because it's so rooted in like theology of the body and stuff. And I always say, like, if I was a pope, the first thing I would do is get rid of that painting and like repaint it in icons or something else and turn it back to a place of worship, because right now it's not
right. Imagery. It becomes a museum, and it's
exactly.
What are museums are about holding things at a distance and examining them, and that's like the furthest thing from like an Eastern. I heard something one time in a podcast about, like, I don't know what the proper pronunciation is, but theoria and praxis, right? Like theory and practice is basically the roots of those words, right? So like theory had something to do with like this eureka moment of like God revealed something to you when you say like, oh, I have an idea, I have a theory, I have a theory, a revelation of God. And praxis is like as you're working things out. Like the Eastern expression has always been, I'm going to do praxis. I'm going to practice the things that have been held in my tradition, that have been handed to me, until I arrive at the theoria, until I arrive at the eureka moment, the revelation of God. Whereas like I think like you've hit on like the Enlightenment and like rationalism and these things, the West has moved, especially like the modern West, like American West and Europe, has moved to this idea of like, I have an idea, now I'm going to do a bunch of practice to prove it. And when that idea stems from you and not from what's been handed down to you and not from God himself, you start to make God in your image rather than to come to that revelation of the image of God and bear that image more properly. It's very inverted, which can be very dangerous.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And to kind of slowly start closing, it's also, I see it even in the discussion of, there's within I feel like the West is uncomfortable with it the most, is the fact that there's dragons in the Bible and even Christ's parables to a certain extent. So I see there's always talk of like, how do you know Christ is speaking metaphorically, and then when he's like in actuality speaking, right? And so, an example is when Christ says, I am the way and the truth and the light. So sometimes most Catholic apologists will say something like, well, he's obviously not actually light, so it's metaphorical. But then you're missing, he's not saying he's these photons or whatever of light. He's saying he's the truth. It's through the human experience of how we experience light. Light reveals something to you, right? Like it reveals the truth of the layout. And so in my estimation, like the that's not a metaphor at all, right? It's like
Yeah.
he is the light. But when you start thinking of it materialistically, like photons and all that, you're starting to miss the point to some extent. And
that kind of reminds me of like the example of like the Eucharist, right? I think it was Pajot that said this at one point, where he's like, you have the Roman Catholic tradition that says, well, this is just real. This is really Jesus. And you have the radical reformers and the Protestant tradition saying this is a symbol. And then you have the Orthodox who are saying this is really Jesus because it's a symbol. And it's like, that's what ties it all together.
Yeah, that's perfect. I always say, when I see that conversation, I'm usually the one that says, no, it is a symbol, but it's not in the symbol way you think it is. It's like the symbol of all symbols, the symbol itself, right? In that manner. But we're at 46 minutes now, so I'm gonna, what's it called? I don't know if there's any other closing thoughts or anything like that you had that you want maybe want to hash out that we've already talked about, or if you want to plug in your podcast or anything one more time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would love that, a dose of theosis.locals.com. Or you can find me on YouTube, a dose of theosis. YouTube for me is more of like a supporter of my locals community. Like locals is where everything happens. We do at least 2 live streams a week. One is typically the community drops articles of interesting things that they're reading, and we just read through them live and react and have a conversation. Fridays historically have been book studies that we've been doing. Most recently, we read through The Way of the Pilgrim, which was very edifying and awesome. And the rest of the week is just everybody posting things and just sharing life together. And my audience is like 99% Roman Catholic, interestingly enough, but they're very open to learning about Eastern expressions. And I learn a lot about Western expressions from them. And the more that happens, the more I really feel we need each other. And we need to spend time together, heartbroken at the fact that we can't all go to the chalice together for communion. Like that's the only way this gets solved. That's the only way this gets fixed. The bishops have been trying to do it for like 1,000 years and it doesn't seem to be working so hot. So like maybe there's something we can do there. And the best part of that community is the amount of prayer that happens, the amount of laughter, the amount of crying, the amount of healing, the amount of encouragement. Like it's just a really good community. And I will set up a code. I will make it up right now. ADOT1, A.1. Anybody who comes over to Locals and uses that code can get a month free so they can access all the supporter content and interact with everything. There's some pretty cool stuff coming down the way, guest blog posts and some recordings of prayer rules and things like that in the style of Hallow. So yeah, check that out. That was long-winded. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to steal the time.
Okay. That's right. No, that was beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. But yeah, and then just last thought for me is, I know this for my listeners, this may have sounded like I was like talking down on the Western right and like saying that Latin Mass is bad, and that's not at all my intention. The reason,
me either, man.
So the reason I'm having this conversation with Derek is to see if there's a possibility to build that up more in a fullness, like learning from each other, you can say, and bringing it all together. So if anyone, hopefully no one is offended while listening to this. This was meant to be more edifying, just recognizing our weaknesses and learning from that.
And the thing is, those of us that swim in the apostolic streams have way more in common than not. And I'm not saying to ignore the things that we don't have in common or the things that are different, but we can celebrate the good things that we agree on this. And then we can use that as a launch point to discuss the other stuff rather than just coming in hot on the things that are different and the things that we disagree about. Because 9 times out of 10, all the times when I hear somebody saying like, you're wrong because of this, it turns out that historically that was not the case. Things are more complicated than you think they are. Things are more nuanced than you think they are. Yeah. Just always think that.
Yeah, for sure. Embrace the mystery.
Yeah,
for sure. All right. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Derek, for stopping by. Hopefully, maybe we can have another conversation sometime in the future. Maybe I can stop by on your podcast the other way around. But
Yeah, I'd love
thank you.
that, man.
But thank you
That'd be
for
great.
coming on this.
Thank you for inviting me, brother. I appreciate it.
If you enjoyed the content here on my channel, please like and subscribe. And if you would like to learn more, I have a blog on my website where you can learn more about symbolism, as well as short form videos and articles on my Instagram page. Thank you for listening, and I hope you tune into the next one.